She was looking at my son the way a jeweler looks at a gem he's about to appraise. I noticed it the first time my son brought her home for Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone else was watching the hockey game, laughing about the Leafs blowing another third-period lead, passing the gravy boat around like it weighed nothing. But she, my son's girlfriend of 8 months, was watching him. Not with love, with calculation. I told myself I was imagining things. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a family law attorney in Vancouver before I retired. I've sat across the table from hundreds of people who wore warm smiles while hiding cold intentions. You'd think that kind of experience would sharpen a man's instincts permanently. But when it's your own child sitting across from you, something short-circuits. You want so badly to be wrong. My son is 34. His name doesn't matter for this story. I'll call him what I've always called him since he was small enough to fall asleep on my shoulder during Canucks games, my boy. He works in commercial real estate in downtown Vancouver, makes a decent living, has his mother's kindness and my stubbornness in equal measure. After his mother passed 6 years ago, it was just the two of us. He moved back in for a year to help me grieve. I moved back out of my own head because of him. He deserved someone who loved him for exactly that. Her name was Danielle. She was 31, originally from Calgary, worked in marketing, pretty in a deliberate way, always dressed like she was about to be photographed. She laughed at everything my son said, touched his arm constantly, made herself indispensable in the way certain people do when they're building something rather than sharing something. The first odd moment I couldn't explain away happened in February, about 10 months into their relationship. My son had asked me to come by his condo to help him hang some shelving in the second bedroom he used as an office. Danielle was there, and at some point while my son was in the garage looking for a drill bit, she wandered to his desk and picked up an envelope sitting beside his laptop. She didn't open it. She just held it for a moment, turned it over once, and set it back down. When she noticed I was watching, she smiled and said she was looking for a pen. There was a full cup of pens 12 inches to the left of that envelope. I said nothing. By spring, she was staying at his place most nights. By summer, she had a drawer, then a shelf, then the larger half of the closet. My son mentioned, in the casual way that meant he'd been thinking about it for some time, that they'd been talking about moving in together properly. He said she was the one, Dad. He said it the way I'd once said it about his mother quietly, like a man who has finally stopped looking. I wanted to believe him. I called my old colleague Margaret, who still practices family law, not for professional reasons, just to talk. I told her I had a feeling about someone and I didn't know what to do with it. She said what she always said, feelings aren't evidence. But pay attention to what the feeling is pointing at. So I started paying attention. What I noticed over the following 2 months was a series of things that were each, individually, explainable. Together, they formed a shape I recognized from 30 years of work. Danielle asked my son, on 3 separate occasions I witnessed, about his work pension and whether the condo was fully paid off. Each time she framed it as practical, talking about their future, thinking about buying a place together. My son answered openly, the way a man does when he trusts someone completely. He'd bought the condo with insurance money from his mother's passing. It was paid off. She knew that within a month of meeting him, I later realized. She also began, slowly, to reshape his social world. A camping trip with his university friends got canceled because she wasn't feeling well and didn't want to be alone. His Friday squash game with his cousin started being skipped. When I called on Sunday afternoons, the calls got shorter, and once he mentioned, without realizing it sounded strange, that Danielle thought he and I talked too much for a grown man and his father. I went cold when he said that. He laughed a little, like he was still deciding whether it was funny. It wasn't funny. I didn't confront him. I'd been a lawyer long enough to know that confronting someone about the person they love without something concrete doesn't protect them. It just isolates you from them. So I waited, and I kept paying attention, and I quietly accepted every invitation he extended because I understood that every visit was now something she could choose to reduce. The engagement happened in September. He called me from the restaurant while she was in the restroom, voice low and happy, said he'd just proposed and she'd said yes. I told him I was glad he was happy. I meant that. I wanted him to be happy. I just wasn't sure she was the reason to be. The wedding was set for the following June, 14 months away. A Saturday in June at a vineyard in the Okanagan, Danielle had found the venue, chosen the date, managed the deposit. My son said she was great at that kind of thing. I'm sure she was. What happened in March, 3 months before the wedding, is where this story turns. My son called me on a Tuesday evening. He didn't say hello the way he normally did. He said, "Dad, can you come over? Not tonight, tomorrow. And bring the folder from Mum's estate if you still have it." I had it. I keep everything. I drove to his condo the next morning. Danielle's car wasn't in the lot. My son met me at the door, and I could see immediately that he hadn't slept properly. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from the inside, from something the mind keeps turning over in the dark. I know it well. I'd seen it in my own face in the mirror for months after his mother died. He made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He didn't speak for almost a minute. Then he said, "I think I made a mistake." He'd found something on her phone 3 nights earlier. He hadn't been snooping. She'd asked him to check a restaurant booking confirmation, and he'd picked it up, and the messages thread was already open. It was a conversation with someone she'd addressed only by initials. In it, she'd described the condo value, the pension details, the RRSP amounts she'd managed to learn over the past year. She'd said the timeline was on track. She'd asked about whether a common law claim could be filed after 1 year of cohabitation or if it required more documentation. My boy sat across from me, and his hands were flat on the table, and he looked like a man who'd just realized the map he'd been following was drawn by someone who wanted him to get lost. "I didn't say I told you so. I will never say that to my child." I said, "You did the right thing coming to me. Now, let's think." We spent 3 hours at that table. I went through the folder from his mother's estate. We looked at what was documented, what was verbal, what was joint, and what was solely his. The condo was in his name. The RRSP and pension were individual accounts. What she may have been angling for under a common law claim depended on cohabitation duration, and they had been living together for just under 11 months at that point. The wedding was in June. After the wedding, the legal picture changed entirely. I told him what I was telling him, not as a lawyer, my license was long retired, but as a man who had spent a career watching what happened when people didn't plan clearly. I told him he needed an independent legal opinion, and he needed it soon. I also told him something else. I told him that whatever he decided, whether he confronted her, whether he walked away quietly, whether he needed more time, I was not going anywhere. I had not gone anywhere in 34 years, and I was not starting now. He cried then, briefly, the way men cry when they've been holding something that was always too heavy. I didn't say anything. I just left my hand on the table where he could reach it if he wanted to. He did. What happened over the following 6 weeks is a longer story than I have room to tell fully, but the shape of it is this. My son spoke to a family lawyer in Burnaby named Robert, a quiet, careful man who confirmed what I'd suspected and helped my son understand exactly where he stood. He also, on Robert's advice, began documenting things he'd previously let pass, dates, comments, the phone conversation he'd partially seen. He did not tell Danielle what he knew. This is the part that people find hardest to understand from the outside. Why continue? Why keep going toward the wedding when you know? The answer is complicated, and my son lived it rather than explained it. He had loved her genuinely. Part of him was still grieving that love even while he was preparing to end it. And there was also something else. She had already collected a great deal of information, and he wanted to understand the full scope of what she'd been planning before he acted. Walking away quietly before knowing the whole picture felt, to him, like only solving half the problem. Robert understood this. I understood this. We moved carefully. In late April, about 6 weeks before the wedding, my son told me he'd found something else. He'd asked a tech-savvy friend to help him check whether the home Wi-Fi had been used to access any accounts he didn't recognize. What they found was that someone had searched, repeatedly from his network, for information about contesting a will in British Columbia, about adding a spouse to property title, and about RRSP beneficiary changes. None of those searches were his. He sat with that knowledge for 2 weeks. I watched him become very still in those weeks, the way water gets still before something moves beneath it. He told me he needed to see it through to the right moment. I trusted his judgment. It was his life. The right moment came on the Saturday of the wedding. The venue was beautiful. I'll give Danielle credit for that. Rows of white chairs facing the mountains. Late afternoon light turning everything golden, the kind of setting that made it easy to believe everything was going to be fine. His aunt and uncle had driven up from Kelowna. His cousin, the one whose squash games had been slowly cancelled, was there. Old friends who hadn't seen him in months because plans kept falling through were there, looking genuinely glad to be back in his orbit. I was standing near the entrance when my son found me. The ceremony was supposed to begin in 40 minutes. He was dressed, composed, and he handed me an envelope. Not a note this time. Inside was a printed summary 2 pages, organized clearly the way I'd taught him to organize things when he was articulating a problem. The searches, the messages, the timeline, the legal exposure, and at the bottom, a single handwritten line, "I'm ready, Dad. I just needed you to have this in case." I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket, and I looked at my son and I said, "What do you need from me right now?" He said, "Just stay close." I stayed close. What happened next, I'll tell you plainly, and without drama, because it didn't need any. My son walked to where Danielle was waiting with her bridal party, and he asked to speak with her privately. Her mother and her 2 friends exchanged glances. He was very calm. He said he needed 5 minutes. They walked to a small room near the vineyard's barrel cellar. I waited outside the door, not listening, but present. That was what he'd asked for. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When he came out, he was pale but steady. She came out a moment later, and her face had changed in the way that faces change when the thing a person has been managing suddenly becomes unmanageable. She didn't look at me. She walked directly to where her mother was standing, said something brief, and within 20 minutes she and her mother were in a car leaving the property. My son's aunt and uncle quietly helped redirect the guests. There were murmurs. There was awkwardness. His cousin put an arm around his shoulders, and they stood like that for a while without needing words. The caterers, in a display of professionalism I will always be grateful for, pivoted the dinner to an informal gathering. People stayed. They ate. Someone found a Bluetooth speaker and put on music. It wasn't a wedding reception, but it was something warmer than I expected. A room full of people who loved my son, remembering how to be around him again. I sat beside him for most of it. At one point, late in the evening when the tables had been pushed aside, and a few of his friends were telling stories from university, he leaned over to me and said, quietly, "I should have called you sooner." When I first saw that message on her phone, I sat on it for 3 days before I called you. I told him the timing didn't matter. He called. That was what mattered. He said, "You never pushed. When you first met her, I could see you had questions. You never pushed." I told him I'd made a promise to his mother a long time ago, that I would be the kind of father my boy could come to, not the kind he had to hide things from. That required me to stay close without crowding, to be available without being overbearing. I hadn't always managed it perfectly, but I'd tried. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She would have liked today, actually, Mum, the mess of it. She always said the best family stories were the ones where everything went sideways." His mother would have laughed at the whole thing. She would have charmed the caterers and made friends with the aunt who drove up from Kelowna and found some way to turn a cancelled wedding into something worth telling. She had that quality, the ability to find the warmth in the wreckage. My son has it too. I'd forgotten that until that night, watching him across a table full of people who'd been quietly kept at a distance for nearly a year, now finding their way back in. There are things I'd do differently. I wish I'd trusted my instincts earlier, not to interfere, but to simply say out loud to my son, "I see something, and I'm here when you're ready to talk about it." Instead, I stayed silent, and watched, and waited, and told myself that was the wiser approach. Maybe it was. Maybe it only felt wiser because confronting it was uncomfortable. I'm still not entirely sure. What I know is this. My boy is well. He's back playing squash with his cousin on Friday evenings. He's back calling me on Sundays and not watching the clock. He took a week off in July and drove out to Tofino, just him and a friend from university, and he called me from the coast one evening while the sun was setting over the Pacific and said the water was cold and beautiful and he felt like himself again. I stood in my kitchen in Vancouver, phone against my ear, and I thought about all the things a father carries quietly for the people he loves. Then I told him to stop describing the sunset and go get dinner before everything on the waterfront closed. He laughed. It was the same laugh he had at 9 years old, loose and sudden and completely unguarded. That's the part I think about most when I sit with this story. Not the wedding that didn't happen, not the legal exposure avoided, not the careful weeks of documentation and strategy. All of that was necessary, but the sound of my son laughing without thinking about it first, that's what I was protecting. That's what it was always about.